welcome everyone to our panel discussion on coming together for police reform, the intersection of mental health and policing. I want to introduce myself. I am Janine Kuhn-Coker, president of the League of Women Voters of Salt Lake. A recording of tonight's event will be made available to the public by our sponsoring organizations through our websites and social media. Other recordings of this event, whether they be in person or on a computer screen, may not be used without the express written approval of the League of Women Voters. The League will only allow audio video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media reporting on this event. Our panel discussion tonight focuses on mental health. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental illness and is in crisis, please call one of the following 24-hour numbers: the Unique Crisis Line, 801-587-300, or the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator. Dr. Emily Salisbury is an associate professor of social work and the director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center at the University of Utah College of Social Work. She is trained as an applied criminologist and focuses her research on the science of correctional treatment interventions, particularly among system-involved women. The Utah Criminal Justice Center is an interdisciplinary research center with the College of Social Work, the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and the College of Social and Behavioral Science at the U. It provides organizations with research, training, and technical assistance grounded in scientific evidence to prevent and reduce crime and victimization among all communities, with an understanding that approaches must be tailored to the contextual needs of organizations and the diverse populations they serve. And Emily, take it from here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate very much the invitation to moderate this event. And I want to thank all the community sponsors for bringing us together tonight. I'm grateful, again, to have been asked and particularly to discuss this important conversation around police reform as it relates to interacting with people with mental illness. So the format for this evening is intended to foster fruitful discussion in a semi-structured way. We have some general guidelines, including an opportunity for each panelist to provide their perspectives on the mental health and policing challenge. I also have some prepared questions for the panelists, and audience members can pose their own questions using the Q&A function. We'll likely get to answering some of those questions later in the session. And before introducing the panelists, I'd like to share a few things to consider. First of all, I think it's important to recognize the many misperceptions and myths surrounding people with mental illness, and to identify what we mean by mental health in this forum. For instance, people in mental health distress do not engage in more violent behavior than those who aren't in distress. Additionally, there are many different kinds of mental health challenges that people work throughout their lives, which do not have uniform causes, symptoms, or treatment interventions. Many of us also have a tendency to immediately think of the more obvious or observable behaviors of mental illness, like delusional behavior, hallucinations, and so on. We really shouldn't forget that the DSM-5 includes 21 major diagnostic classes and over 150 different diagnoses, which also includes many intellectual, developmental, and neurological disorders. And perhaps most importantly, we must understand that people are more than their mental illness or diagnosis, who have a number of strengths and abilities that are worth bearing in mind. Basically, you're around people with mental illness all the time, whether you know it or not. We also have to recognize the incredible challenge facing police chiefs and police agencies today in attempting to change systems, operations, and methods of interaction that have been in place for generations. I truly cannot imagine the competing interests and political pressures that police chiefs face in today's social context. Addressing such painful issues like racial injustice, which is embedded in our history and throughout our institutions, while at the same time managing individuals, both internal and external to the agency, who don't really always agree on the role of policing, is a very intimidating leadership challenge, to say the least. It's also important to know that the vast majority of frontline police work is not what most people think it is. Most of the time on patrol is responding to mundane aspects of everyday life and minor conflicts between people, not necessarily responding to people in serious mental distress. But of course, when tragic harm, especially lethal harm, occurs by police, it harms whole communities, not just the primary victims. And when certain marginalized groups are disproportionately affected, we simply must make every effort to understand the causes and consequences of these disparities to reduce it. Doing so requires using and really institutionalizing the scientific knowledge of policing that makes it effective, fair, and legitimate. So with that, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists this evening. Elizabeth Kelch is the director of the Utah Substance Use and Mental Health Advisory Council, which was formed 30 years ago. The council's mission is to create and coordinate a comprehensive strategy to effectively address substance use and mental health disorders throughout Utah. Prior to her directorship, Elizabeth worked with the local mental health and substance use authority system at the Utah Association of Counties. Welcome, Elizabeth. Jessica Waters is the social work director for the Salt Lake City Police Department Community Connections team. She's worked for Salt Lake City Police Department since 2016 when the program first began. The program was the first in the state of Utah to be a co-responder program entailing social workers responding to mental health, suicide, substance use, homelessness, and any social issue 911 calls with law enforcement. Jessica has many years of frontline work experience in the areas of intellectual disability, geriatrics, hospice, mental health, substance use, and homelessness in sites across the country. Prior to joining Salt Lake Police, she worked with the Public Defender's Office coordinating specialty court referrals and competency screenings, along with being a therapist in the jail substance abuse treatment setting. Marlon Lynch is the inaugural Chief Safety Officer at the University of Utah. As the CSO, Marlon provides leadership, development, coordination, and direction for all aspects of campus safety at the U, promoting a safe, secure, and service-oriented environment for all students, faculty, staff, alumni, and visitors to the university. The Office of the CSO centralizes the institution's safety and security functions. Operational direct reports are the University Police, U Health Security, Campus Security, Emergency Management, and Community Services. His career progression includes 27 years of public safety experience in the municipal, campus, and healthcare environments. Good to see you again, Marlon. Misty Mulkey is an advocate and peer support specialist at Journey of Hope. She became a peer leader in 2016 and a sexual assault recovery advocate shortly thereafter. She spent 3 years as a volunteer with Utah Support Advocates for Recovery Awareness. Misty is in long-time recovery with almost 17 years of sobriety and is also a cancer survivor and a formerly incarcerated person. As a survivor herself, she has the honor and privilege of working with women, girls, LGBTQ+ individuals, and their safe partners to move from violence to healing. Through these efforts, she helps clients navigate the criminal justice system and hopes to start conversations that help first responders understand the experience and needs of her clients. We're so very fortunate to have each of you with us today. At this time, I'd like to turn the session over to the panelists to give their perspective on what they feel really are the mental health and policing challenges of today. Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to begin, if you don't mind.
Happy to. Thank you, Emily. The USAFE Council is an advisory council to our governor. And as part of that, we have many of our local government, state government, and then other advocates as members of our council. And this has obviously been a topic of conversation for us over the last 30 years, but specifically over the last 5 to 10 years, as we've figured out what is the right solution for Utah. We are very pleased to support and we have done a lot of discussion and research along those topics of how to best help individuals that are suffering from mental health disorders and substance use issues best get into treatment at the right time, the right place, and with the right supports so that they can enter long-term recovery. And I want to applaud Misty. That is quite a feat. So very, very impressive. But that's not always easy. And I'm sure we can all talk about how there are many barriers. And our goal as a council is to figuring out how to eliminate some of those barriers and keep this in a place where people can recover in the best way possible, which is often keeping them out of criminal setting it altogether and trying to keep it early and have interventions early in issues and in what we would call the sequential intercept model, which I can go into more detail later, but helping them early on and so that they can keep this as a civil process rather than a criminal justice one.
Thank you so much. Marlon, Chief Lynch, would you mind?
Sure, thank you. It's a situation. I was listening to your introduction earlier in regards to, the roles that the police chiefs have had to navigate, not just recently, but, for decades in regards to it. And specifically within my community, within a university setting, although our primary community are 18 to 24-year-olds, we are a destination, not only for the state of Utah, but for others visiting as well. And so we encounter everyone. And with that requires a response that is applicable to everyone. So we have a good understanding of what our community is like, but at the same time, when we speak of a response for someone that is, suffering a mental health crisis, it is something that our officers have a requisite level of training for, but not the same professional skill set as, say, a social worker or someone who has had specific training for that. And so for us, although our officers have been trained, it's the expectation, right? The expectation of, police are called for a lot of different things and not necessarily law enforcement, as you indicated with that. And so it's being prepared to respond to whatever is presented to that responding officer. A call into dispatch for a call for service does not necessarily materialize to be what the call was that came in. And so that officer needing the ability to assess, but what we've tried to figure out is how can we get all of the potential tools there at the same time or within a reasonable amount of time, and to slow things down in regards to not necessarily having to solve it immediately if it facilitates that, but taking the appropriate response, assessing it, getting an additional professional there to assist and working through the problem or the crisis really at that point to get a very positive outcome. So I see that as the challenge with it. And it's not as easy as some may think in those regards. And, we're working through it and trying to consult as many subject matter experts as possible for the appropriate level of response, and then also educating our community on what to expect from us with that, and helping, allowing or encouraging the community to help define what the role of police will be as well.
Thank you so much, Chief Lynch. Appreciate that. Misty, can I invite you to join us?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I want to I feel so honored to be a part of this panel. Um, and I lose my words a lot. So hopefully that doesn't happen very often throughout this, and I'm able to.
Fine. Absolutely.
In preparation for this, I have a baby brother that is an officer, and I spent a lot of time on the phone with him and with another friend of mine that's an officer here in Salt Lake, um, to try to have a balanced view so that I didn't come in here all against, one against the other, because I feel like if we're not all on the same page and working together, we're never going to get anywhere. And what fascinated me about my conversation, especially with my baby brother, is that we were saying the same thing, different words a little bit, right? But the same thing. We all we both believe that you have to go all the way back to when these people, these with the mental illnesses and with the different crises that law enforcement comes across, you got to go all the way back to when they're young, because if you look at the ladies that are out in the prison, they are all survivors of some form of trauma. And if we can catch that trauma while they're still in grade school or middle school or high school, and we can interrupt that sexual assault to prison pipeline and get in there when they're young and kind of stop some of these traumas, so we don't have women and girls with these ACE scores that are just ridiculous, right? I feel like we would make it would help with the change. We would be able to start moving forward, right? But number one, we have to find a way to bridge the gap so that so that both sides are listening. I think that's my most important thing. We just got to get to the point where both sides are listening to the other side and we're working together, because we're all saying the same thing.
I agree. Misty, well stated, and you're getting some shout outs in the chat, right? For saying what you're saying. Yeah. The intersection of trauma and mental health and mental illness is real. I still have to debate sometimes people in my field in criminology about the importance of trauma, and shame on my colleagues because they haven't seen the evidence and talked to people on how important it really is. So thank you for that. Jessica, can you join us?
Yes, once again, thanks for having me as well. Yeah, I'm in a tricky situation. I am a social worker who rides alongside with officers. And I think some barriers that come to mind right away is the fact of the lack of our preventative mental health services, because the calls that we are going to are people's worst day of their life. And oftentimes people don't know who to call besides the police. And so thankfully we have a team where we have social workers respond with police to any of these mental health related calls in hopes that we can help connect people to services, help relate with them, and also just figure out what's a long-term plan, what the client wants at that moment. But what's tricky is, obviously we don't want to have police being the ones who are specialists in this, but unfortunately, they have become the specialists. And I think a lot of that has been lack of mental health services, substance use services, housing, and police have to be the first responder to these. And I think it's interesting, even though I got my master's in social work, I didn't see the type of mental health that I have seen on this job until I got into this job. And to recognize that police have seen so much raw, real mental health, and they're figuring out like what is their role in it as well, because they don't want to be that one I'm seeing most of the time, from my understanding is, but that's no one knows who to call besides 911. So that's a tricky part of where do we go if we can't go to 911? And also, like I mentioned, these are people's worst day of their life, where thankfully we are able to respond together, but big barriers are the fact that we don't know who to call and when to call. And so 911 is our call no matter what.
Yeah. So I think educating people on things like mental health first aid, certain things about de-escalation, right? Using 211, which is run by the United Way for non-emergency, reasons. I think all of this information is really important to get out there to the community. And I agree with you. I think, one of the many things that are really hard for people to accept on this issue is that we keep trying to train police officers to learn more about de-escalation and crisis intervention and mental health behaviors more generally. But at the end of the day, these are police officers, and we can't train them to become clinicians or social workers. We can certainly arm them with more tools in the toolbox. But at the end of the day, we're trying to force it, I think, in my opinion. And as a result of many different reasons, but certainly, of course, the lack of funding around the services around mental health and substance use and early intervention. So I'd like to kind of transition to some prepared questions that we have for the group. And then, anybody can jump in and just please, let's have an organic kind of conversation about it. So we've seen firsthand in Salt Lake City that, again, crisis intervention teams and de-escalation training just isn't enough to prevent the shooting of citizens and mental health crisis. Talk to me about what you think is missing. What else is missing besides money?
I'll jump in on this one. I think answers, honestly. There's a lot of discussion of what we need to do, what we should do. This is a big topic that our country is really trying to focus on, but there's no concrete answer. Like, this is what we need to do. Here's a copy and paste to every police department, and this will work. Because if we had that answer, we'd be implementing it right away. We don't want to be in these situations. We don't want to have to be in these risky calls. With some mental health calls, they're very uncomfortable. Even though I am a civilian and a social worker, it's still a very big risk for me to go on some of these calls. And so I think what's missing is for people to understand the spectrum of calls that we see, because I think a lot of people imagine someone, maybe suffering with anxiety or depression in their apartment and, talking about taking pills or any of that. And I think what we're missing is there's this other level of someone running through the street with a machete. What do we do in that? Because as a social worker, I wasn't trained in that either. And that is a mental health related incident. So I think where we're lacking is understanding the spectrum of, civilians can strictly respond to a call versus when there are weapons involved, respond. I know we love like concrete answers, and every department, every city, every rural town too, they all have different ways that they could go about it. And there's not just one setup that will work for all police departments. And I think that's the tricky part, is what are those answers exactly? And how does it relate with, what are the answers to Salt Lake itself?
Absolutely.
If
I
I
feel
can
like-
jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Misty.
Go ahead, Liz.
Nope, you
Okay.
start.
Okay. I feel like this is a really difficult question, because there is no hard and fast answer that's going to work for everywhere, right? In my conversation with one of the officers I talked to, he was telling me about in Seattle where they're defunding the police, and part of that they're sending out caseworkers, social workers, and a gal named Christy Benson went out and was stabbed and killed. So there's got to be something in between, right? And I struggle with the definitely more training, right? But at the same time, there's like, I know there's specialists, that there's a group of police that they specialize in how to de-escalate and how to handle mental illness, right? Because when you come out and I'm in a complete breakdown and flipping my shit, right? Different, not the same thing isn't gonna help me every time, and it's gonna be different based off of what is going on in my brain. And that's where it makes it very difficult, because like you said in the beginning, the DSM is, it's a huge book, and we are all some kind of a mesh up of, PTSD and this and this and this and this and this, right? Um, but I feel like it I don't know where to go from that, right? Because I feel like, but when you get to the point where we're in crisis, right, and we're standing there, and the person with the mental health issue is standing there and has something in their hand, whether it and whether it's a cell phone or a gun, and the officer comes in, he's been told it's a gun, and then there's gonna be bad, it's not gonna end well, right? That's where I feel like it has to start way before that. We need more treatment centers. We need more counselors. We need more ability to get to them before they get to that place. And I don't, so
That's helpful. That's helpful, Misty. It is. Um, I mean, without a doubt, we need more resources around these issues and early intervention. It just has to be part of a holistic solution, which is going to be very multifaceted and different in various social contexts, right? What works in Salt Lake City is not going to be the same thing that works, in another city in a different region. So I thank you for that, Misty. Liz, did you want to chime in?
I would love to. I wanted to talk about a few things that I'm sure both Chief Lynch and Jessica know about, and the concept of a mobile crisis outreach team is something that is important to everyone, because as Jessica was saying, this is a team that should help to address, and there is a limitation on resources. Obviously, it takes a lot of people to make a great outreach team, and to have that available 24/7 is so taxing on both our law enforcement as well as the therapists and the rest of the team that's involved. I mean, I can't even imagine. And especially in Salt Lake County and City, these teams are out so often that there is no recovery time. So you have to understand, when you start talking about these things, that they are asking a lot of both individuals as well as county and city and government and state resources. However, they're important because, as Misty said, and as Jessica said, these people are experiencing something that they don't want to, first of all, that is very difficult for them. And as Jessica said, the worst day of their lives. And so knowing how to put that team together, understanding the sacrifices that both law enforcement as well as the rest of the behavioral health professionals that go out on this team are making to be part of this, because they could probably find an easier job somewhere else. But knowing that the impact that they make is so important. And we are seeing in the 2020 legislative session, there was a bill and funding that was distributed to the entire state to create more of these mobile crisis outreach teams, as well as receiving centers. So there will be 4 receiving centers in the next 5 years, I think. And we've seen a lot of wonderful things that come from that, because with receiving centers, the beauty of that is that you're able to address the situation and those people are able to see what's going on. So if it's a police officer or a law enforcement officer, or if it's a social worker that arrives first on the scene and sees, okay, I think we can de-escalate this situation and take it from, the worst day of their lives to something that maybe they can handle and they can stay here, great. If they need to be removed and go to a safe space that is not within the criminal justice system, a receiving center is a great option, because they are still in control. They can leave when they need to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is being able to address all the 5 W's, right? The who, the what, the where, the when, the why, but doing it based on the training and everything that all the individuals, I apologize, see. Emily warned me, everyone, that I should turn off all the noises, and I thought I did, but no, I guess I didn't get that one. So I think that that's very important, and understanding that if we can address things earlier on, as Misty was saying, that is a very helpful thing. And many of those we can take, for example, the Uni Crisis Line, 90% of the issues at the Uni Crisis Line are resolved and don't need an MCOT team, a mobile crisis outreach team, to go out. Out of the 10% that need an MCOT team, 70% of those are resolved. So we know that this works, and that if we can address it earlier, it's better for everybody involved. And I have to tip my hats to all the law enforcement officers that go into this training. And as Chief said, not a lot of them knew that this is what they were signing up for. And Jessica as well has said she didn't know that this was what she was necessarily signing up for. However, we see that good people make a big difference in these people's lives.
Thank you so much, Liz. Chief Lynch.
Yeah, I would just echo what has been stated, but I would like to pick up where Liz has left off with that is, just as we were taught, as growing up to dial 911, for police, we have to educate our community, our family members, everyone in regards to the options that are available to assist someone in mental health crisis, because it is not always the first go-to for police with that. Again, the Uni hotline is the mobile crisis outreach teams, the receiving centers, all of them play a role in that. And so do police. Everyone plays a role in that. And the component of it is how situations are handled are circumstantial. What are the facts of what's happening at that particular time? And, one important component of that is, if the time allows, is that it doesn't have to be, in most cases, immediately resolved at that particular time. Take the time to assess it and get the experts there to assist with it. Easier said than done when you respond to a call, especially if it came in a manner to where the person is aggressive and potentially harmful to themselves and others. However, it's, again, knowing what resources are available, how to get them there, and making that recognition is extremely important. But I would say it begins on the front end with the education of our communities in regards to what resources are available to them. Again, I recall early in my career where these services were available 24/7. You could actually call and reach someone that could actually come out and respond and things like that. A lot of that has been removed. And so it becomes, sort of almost the Swiss Army knife are the police. You come out and you handle all the situations the best that you can. And some, and that's not necessarily the best way to do it. So, but there are resources out there that are established that can assist. And I think that we have to, we have to have an educational campaign in what 211 is. I would be surprised if we polled people that are listening to this now, prior to Emily, your explanation of what it is, who actually knew what that was. And if it was available, how many people actually are aware of the Uni hotline? How many people are aware of MCOT, the mobile crisis outreach team? So those are things, the components that we have to do, as well as that we have to continue to share the resources and make it a campaign in that particular regards.
Thank you. Yeah, I also think it's really important to have the conversation about access to resources. We can have all the resources that we, need, and some communities disproportionately affected, by multiplicative vulnerabilities, just simply don't have as much access. And so I wonder if anybody wants to sort of discuss what they think, how do we start, improving access to resources? And yes, people can pick up a phone and call, but when we're talking about people who, are undocumented, what are they supposed to do? And I also think it's really important to also discuss police legitimacy and trust. We are living in an age, and this isn't new, but where our social institutions, including policing, we just have a massive amount of eroded trust. And so, Bill, I think one of the things that we absolutely have to start doing is building community trust and legitimacy in the police again. And that is not easy work. It takes system-wide changes about how policing has been traditionally done. It takes a strong leader and leadership values and character to start admitting some things that are not easy to admit. For instance, in some programs that are about reducing violence in certain communities, sometimes the police have to go into communities and say, we're sorry. We didn't intend to be racist. We didn't intend to be, all of these things that we didn't intend to lose your trust, but we recognize where we are, and we have to start healing. We have to start reconciling. We have to start moving forward in some way, shape, or form. And again, that is not easy work to do.
So, Emily, I can start with that one because actually you've described our situation at the U in that regards, and reestablishing, rebuilding the credibility and legitimacy with that, and we've taken the approach of the inclusive component with it, a public safety advisory committee that for us it's comprised of 50% students. It's co-chaired by 2 students. We meet regularly. And part of that group is to, as we share strategic initiatives, present it to them for their comment and feedback, and also in help in implementation, and for them to have an opportunity to share with us what's important to them. For example, we just presented a strategic plan to that particular committee. We had our thoughts in regards to what we need to do, correct? But the community themselves has, their ideas. And so the feedback was there are certain things that were more important and how they would like to participate. We've done that. The inclusion of review of policies and general orders with that, inclusion of in hiring processes and promotional processes. So they're seeing it, they're being directly involved in what's going on. So it's that, those types of situations to where, again, encouraging the community to help define what the role of police is and how they would like to be policed when that is available and when those options are there, to seek it and include it with it. And so it becomes part of, again, being part of the community on the day-to-day and not showing up on the worst day of their lives.
Right. Building that trust and legitimacy is just so critically important. And I can imagine you've had to take a look at every single policy and procedure and, rethink it, reimagine it, as you mentioned, right? And again, takes strong leadership. It takes a strong amount of resources and abilities and, quality staff and officers to make these things happen, and an ability to listen, right? An ability to listen to your stakeholders, of which are students, faculty, community, visitors to the university, and so on. So I appreciate that. I think if there's one thing that we have to do, in my opinion, as a society in this country and in individual local police departments, is to start building trust again. Anybody else have thoughts about how we can start to do that?
I kind of
think-
feel like that one thing that came out of my discussions was that the police force needs to look like the community that they are serving. It helps, right? The inclusion, but I think we need to start with like some kind of an education, right? So we need to come to a point where we are not talking about us and them. The us and them has to go away, right? Because like as a child, when I was growing up in that trauma and in that in that mess, you know, they were the boogeyman that were going to come through the door in the middle of the night, and then they were going to take me away. I'd never see my family again, right? But then as an adult, when I was incarcerated and had my FBI, and the way that they treated me, and they treated me like I was a lady, they treated me with respect, they always treated me as a person. And my my personal outlook on police changed fundamentally. I mean, it went from night and day, right? And I want to find a way where we can help my clients, the people, ladies that I work with. I want to find a way that I can help them experience that same change of outlook, right? And I think having people like me, the peers that have been through it, survived it, figured out how to get past it, get them involved as soon as possible, right, with our survivors and our victims, and get the peers in there as soon as we can, so that we can start healing those divides, so that it's no longer us and them, it's
Yeah.
we, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that made sense.
It does. It makes sense. It makes absolute sense, Misty, right? The us versus them mentality. Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing that still, unfortunately, today in my local community, about the us versus them, particularly protesters coming into Cottonwood Heights and, you know, saying, well, these are not our community members, and why are they protesting, and having this sort of mentality. And I just, you know, they're community members and they have a right to protest. The us versus them mentality, and on both sides of that, not just in one direction. Those are the kinds of conversations and, you know, real intense discussions that need to happen. And again, with an intent to listen. We live in an age where we are so partisan and so polarized that it is so difficult to have conversations without people shutting down immediately. And so, you know, I want to encourage people, if you're interested in learning how to have more diverse conversations, go to Open Mind platform. Open Mind platform. I teach it in my classes, and there are corporate platforms about how to have better conversations with people that you disagree with, in order to just have regular discourse and debate. Where has discourse and debate gone? We don't have it anymore. And if, again, as somebody mentioned, I think it was you, Misty, earlier on, if we're not hand-in-hand in partnership trying to work with agencies to improve services, if we don't use our voice about the kind of police department and the kind of policing that we want to see, you know, then we may not get the solutions that we want. I think it's also really important to think about the quality of policing, and thinking about data-driven, evidence-based strategies that we know in policing are producing fair and legitimate and effective policing strategies. The science of this exists. And so that's sort of my professor hat coming on, right? And the research director hat coming on, saying, we just simply need to make sure that we are also not just doing sort of fly-by-night sorts of, you know, things, just because we have the low-hanging fruit around body cams, for instance, body cameras, or crisis intervention, certainly, or implicit bias training. In my opinion, that's the low-hanging fruit. That's the stuff that's certainly easier to start implementing. But if we're going to have real change and real reform, particularly in communities of color, we got to think bigger. We're getting a number of really excellent questions also in the question and answer. And so I just thought maybe we'll go to a couple, since they're relevant to the discussion right now. So Ron is asking and commenting on the fact that smaller police departments have small budgets and pick up employees oftentimes from the bottom of the barrel. So how do we expect a highly trained force? It's difficult to happen, and he indicates it's not going to happen, right? So some of us also think, there are some scholars out there who truly feel that increasing the criteria to become a police officer, requiring a college degree, is one thing. But as Chief Lynch and perhaps others on this panel sort of know, we're also at a crisis in terms of recruiting.
Mhm.
So I'll stop there.
And I kind of jump in on that one too. Also tying into like the last discussion, last question as well as I think a lot of times we often forget police. I mean, not forget police, but I mean in support of police for having enough officers. And so just imagining how much trauma officers witness and see, and there's not enough staffing in the police force to give those officers breaks or to give people that time to calm down, cool off after a call, because there's so many calls happening nonstop, call after call after call after call. And I think that's something we often forget is the fact that one, it's hard to hire officers in the first place. And then two, if we're short staffed and all the different calls that police are going to back and forth, I think community-based policing is very important, where officers become familiar, become a part of a community, a part of a neighborhood. But unfortunately right now, police don't have that downtime to be able to build those relationships, to be able to build that trust back up again, because they are sent back to back to back to back to back. At least in right now with Salt Lake, I know we've been, our officers have been nonstop going back to back with calls. So yeah, kind of keeping in mind, like the gentleman had asked about how do we get more officers? How do we make it an appealing job? I mean, it's pretty hard to find people who really want to become a cop, especially right now. And we still need police in some way or another, to keep people safe. But how do we recruit that? How do we find that when even the morale is kind of low in the policing world right now too, of, that's where do they fall in the line of their own identity and what's going on in the world and how they're viewed. And then also how the policing agency or just criminal justice system is viewed in general, with a long history. Not the best history. Our criminal justice system, we all know, has been flawed in many ways. So I think that is a tricky part of, I think community-based policing would help improve that trust with police and with community members, but also a lot of police departments don't have that capacity right now to be able to do that. They're just kind of surviving as best as they can to keep going.
Jessica, can I ask you a question along those lines? I know with Journey of Hope, we are given so many hours during the week to for self-care and to deal with the vicarious trauma that we are experiencing every day with our clients. And I can only imagine an officer and all of the things that they see and they do. How do they get time in their week to for the self-care? Do they get time? I mean, are you guys too strapped to be able to do
I
that?
love I love that question, and I appreciate it. And I've talked about that a few times, but no, we don't get that. We do every now and then if there's been a really heavy call every now and then, we have what's called a peer support team who's there for officers, but that officer has to reach out and say, I'm in distress. I need to talk to somebody. It'd be nice if we had a big enough peer support team who was seeking out, like, oh, I noticed that Misty went on this call today. That one was probably kind of heavy. Should I call them up? We don't have that, at least I'm only speaking on behalf of Salt Lake, but that would be so wonderful if officers had that time to decompress, take in all that time. We do get some therapy paid for in our police department, but with police, it's also, my understanding, it's been hard for them to find a therapist that they trust and feel safe with as well. And I don't know if Chief Lynch wants to touch on that one.
Yeah, I have a couple of follow-up points. I had the initial question from the gentleman regarding maybe rural or small agencies not necessarily having the resources in regards to training and different things, or even staff size. That's the reality. I think that goes back to what Professor Salisbury was saying in regards to access, access for services from certain communities. It's not just access for like health services, it's also access for police services. That can be a challenge in some particular areas with that. In regards to recruiting for police, there are some departments, there are very few that require a 4-year college degree. But the other component of that is, that's great to have that formal education training. I think that's a great thing to have. But, what do we get then for those who maybe don't have that, who have the potential to be trained and to go into one of the ongoing debates is policing a profession or not, a defined profession. And some will say a profession is something that requires a 4-year degree in order to do that. Maybe then policing is more of a trade because you train and you receive a certificate and different things like that. Well, that's debatable, in regards to what's going to be more applicable. What you learn in a classroom, and what's more important is how you perform in a practical situation, which is a lot of what policing is along those particular lines with it. The data-driven component and strategies, I think that goes hand in hand with the data for officer wellness. Because if the officer is not healthy mentally and emotionally, that will impact his or her performance as well. And something that I have interest in is, in building in that time on shift for officers. And so, if it's a 10 or 12 hour shift, maybe it's an hour that's worked into that as a downtime component, to where whether it's physical fitness, workout component, or it's downtime in the restroom, like in a resting room, to be able to sit and gather your thoughts. And then go back into, back to your assignment and different things, a decompression type of component. You think about it in most scenarios in working, there's an opportunity for breaks and different things like that. It is not uncommon for that radio to go the full shift, and you go from call to call to call to call. And unless there is a critical incident that happens, it's not likely that supervisor will pull officers aside and, then, allow for some downtime and things of that nature. And the other component regarding the trust of officers and therapists or doctors and different things like that, there's not a lot there because it could potentially impact their work if they're deemed to not be fit for duty and different things like that, or things that'll be held in confidence, that it's not going to be shared with police administration. So there's a lot that goes into it. I'm not, for the, saying that there are a bunch of excuses of why jobs cannot be done. I think these are a lot of facts that just maybe not known in regards to what comes into it. The component of an officer or police dealing with people on the worst days of their lives. Think of the calls that come in. That's what the officers are doing. And in probably at least 50% of those interactions, they're dealing with people in a situation where that's not usually who they are. And that will eventually wear on the officer as well.
Chief Lynch, one of the things that you mentioned makes me think, and it's something we can talk about offline too, but in my working with correctional agencies, primarily prisons, jails, probation, and parole, to help implement evidence-based practices. And as we have moved to more trauma-responsive care in corrections, we're now nowhere near being effective in terms of implementing it in a widespread way. But there are curricula out there that I think are very important for you to know about and for others to know about, like at Salt Lake City and other agencies. It's called Creating Regulation and Resilience. And it's this idea of how to have regulation in ourselves first before we can even regulate anybody else. And the things that we have to do, right? Even in just a split second, we can do these things very calmly and very quickly. Because oftentimes, of course, police work requires split-second decisions and making sure that we're regulated first before we try to regulate anybody else. It's basically a communication strategy. And important to start building certainly the self-care and mental health resources for our police force, for sure. I've got a question here from Diana. I work for a Utah Police Department as the community outreach coordinator. And one of the challenges that I face is the community letting us build trust. Sometimes, no matter how much we try, there are people who just don't want to build trust. Liz, I wonder if we could hear from you.
Sure. This, what a profound statement, first of all, thank you. Because this speaks to a lot of the concerns surrounding mental health and substance use. To me, mental health disorders are often misunderstood and mischaracterized and criminalized and everything else. And Utah has done a lot of work in the last 5 years, but what has been lacking is the treatment resources to go along with that. So we've done a lot of good on the criminal justice end, and what took a while was getting the other treatment resources in place, like Medicaid and some of these other resources where people can easily get into treatment. So when you have issues like that, when there are issues surrounding, well, they didn't understand me for my entire life, it's going to take a lot of work and patience and everything else that is often difficult in these situations because they are not quiet, patient sort of circumstances. They are often very difficult and explosive and everything else that we've talked about in the last little while. So I think that making sure that we continue to have this discussion and correct the path, if you will, and make sure that we're always taking in those community discussions and exercising them and making changes at the state government level, at the local government level, and within your own communities. There are very many tiers that this all needs to happen. And unfortunately, this requires people that are committed and that are active and involved. So I'm very impressed with all of our attendees, because I feel like this is a good sign that people are going to pay attention. They're going to engage. And hopefully that means that eventually in having those conversations and making those changes, that we'll get to a better place of trust, and that it can go both ways. One of the things I wanted to say that related to our last topic is that there has been legislation that's been introduced, and they're working on how to get behavioral health treatment resources to any peace officer at any level in the place that they're most comfortable with. That's because of individuals that brought this attention to their legislators, who brought it to the state level and said, this needs to be considered. We need to have no barriers for these individuals. That's something that explains to me, or demonstrates, at least to me, that this is something that we can talk about and then figure out what is the right course to take. But it's going to take a lot of active and engaged people speaking about an issue and then being committed to finding a good answer.
Well said. Absolutely. We've got another question coming in that I'd like to address. Let me find it. The issue of civilian review boards. Do we need civilian review boards that has actual teeth and some power to make changes and to make some decisions? Police unions must reform to police and transform their culture, shouldn't they? So yeah, civilian review boards are absolutely one of the options on the table across many jurisdictions in this country. Complex issues surrounding it, for sure, and complex issues surrounding police unions as well. Qualified immunity, for instance, all kinds of different things that we could be talking about. But yeah, so the question is about civilian review boards. Do we need civilian review boards that have teeth?
Yeah, I'll start with the discussion with that. I think that there is a role for civilian review boards in regards to what they can and cannot do. I think it's beyond even the police departments themselves. I know, being a state agency as we are at the U, sometimes there are state employee relations components that have to come into consideration for things of that nature. If there is an active union, collective bargaining agreements as well with it. But there's also research that shows that civilian review boards are also not as maybe tough on officers as some people may think. I know from, some colleagues that have had them for large municipal agencies that sometimes the police chief or commissioner or superintendent wants to take more severe action, and it's overturned by the civilian review board more times than not.
Yeah.
In that regards. And so it's not the overall solution that I think that has just been presented with the overall current narrative regarding police reform. Again, I think the data and the research shows that civilian review boards can be effective, but they're not as, tough on the police officers as some may think with that. A place, yes. Complete solution, no. But I think there's some good components of it, most definitely. It allows for that additional level of transparency in what's going on, some true insight into how the whole process works for that. But again, their level of direct impact has proven not to be to the level that some may think.
Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I think with civilian review boards, I think an important part of it is for those civilians to have the opportunity to, like we do, a civilian academy, like a mock academy to learn what policing is. But as a civilian, you go through it, it's adjusted. I think that's an important part to it, so the civilians can understand what goes into a call. Because me coming into this job before working for the police, I had my ideas of how and why police responded to calls. Until I came into it, did I learn how to knock on a door in the safest way possible, when I didn't realize there was a safe way to knock on a door or not. And so I think an important part of, if there are civilian review boards, for those civilians have opportunities to go through like a civilian academy to understand all the dynamics and all the policies that impact the decisions on the spot, because there is a lot that goes into it. And I've been with Salt Lake Police for almost 5 years, and there's still so much that I don't know and I don't understand. But I think with that, it also builds a better understanding of what all goes into a police response versus what we imagine goes into a police response. Like I mentioned, approaching a door. I don't just walk straight up to a door and knock on it. And how exactly do I need to approach the door? And, and so I think, yeah, like Chief Lynch said, I haven't looked a lot into the research on that. So that is very interesting to hear that perspective on that, Chief, about not being as harsh. Because I think, at least for me, I would assume they would be harsher, but that's interesting to hear.
Yeah, and again, I think we have to look at the evidence-based research to suggest what kinds of solutions are likely to work in our communities. Absolutely. We've got a question from David. Oh, did somebody want to chime in? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just have a quick question
Yeah, go ahead.
Chief Lynch. Do you think that it would be productive or helpful to have someone like me who's been through peer training on a call, to when it comes to like a mental health call? Would it help to have a peer with you on something like that, or would that hinder your ability to respond?
I think that, that's actually something that we've considered in our response that we're developing with police and social workers. Jessica made reference earlier in regards to, there are some people believe that for mental health crisis calls, just send a social worker. But I think if you talk to a social worker, you'd get the response of not so much, right? Because we want to make sure that it's safe for that reason. And it would be the same for a peer, right? So that would be another person. However, I do think that there is a role for someone with your experience, specifically like within the training component of how, in that training level of the officers responding, and your perspective on, what your needs are as a person who has, you've experienced it, and what, how you feel and what your view has been of police and your interactions. Those are learning opportunities for the officers. So there's definitely a role. Is it in an actual response? I think that I would probably want to talk to someone more like with Jessica's skill set to say, hey, how would you utilize, from a police perspective, my perspective is going to be different from, say, a crisis support specialist in regards to what role would be the best for someone with your experiences in a response component.
Interesting.
I just wanted to add as well, if I can, to that question and answer. I think it's important to understand that as the different agencies work together. So for example, in Weber County, they're already having dispatch patch calls that are dealing with mental health over to the behavioral health providers. That causes the law enforcement and the behavioral health providers to work together daily. So they're talking about these individuals that may be what we would say as frequent visitors or somebody that they know of. And so in working with those agencies together, I think that's helping to better understand what's going on in these communities and helping to have that kind of collaborative work environment that then helps other people to understand what their law enforcement is going through on a daily basis and also what the needs are. And so some of those things are happening and probably should happen everywhere, but it's going to take time and effort and energy to do that.
We've got another question from an anonymous attendee who says, I, being the police, have been called by mental health workers to the hospital on people in mental health crisis who have been kicked out of the mental health unit of the hospital because they've burned their bridges with the doctor. Is this conversation being had with our healthcare professionals? Do we know?
So I can tackle that if I can. Definitely, we work with our our physical health providers as well, and the Utah Hospital Association. And some of the work that they've done over the last couple of years has been instrumental in understanding the level of need in emergency care situations, as well as in their regular day-to-day. It's been astronomical what our physicians, our nurses have had to deal with, and it's taking a toll on them. And we, in this environment of COVID, I mean, you'd hope that nothing would do this to them, but it's definitely a problem. And we're understanding how we can better get those people, because they don't always belong in an emergency care situation. So when I talk about receiving centers, that might be a good option for some of these individuals. They need a safe place to process some of their emotions and through some of the addictions that they're experiencing at that time, and get into a safe place that is not as, well, first of all, expensive, but also to both them and to the system as a whole, but also not as taxing. It's not going to take them as difficult. But we have doctors, we have nurses, and other individuals, healthcare professionals that are seeing an astronomical increase in violence towards them. It's not something that we need to happen. It needs to be addressed, and we're trying to get there. But hoping that some of these solutions, such as receiving centers, can be a resource to individuals rather than having to go to emergent care.
Can I piggyback off of Liz too? I appreciate you saying that, and I also appreciate that question. That's me as a crisis worker. It's one of my biggest barriers is the ER system. And I can't wait for these receiving centers. I wish they could be up now and going. And I know we'll have our growing pains that we'll have to learn through as we use those. But being a mental health officer, meaning that I can pink sheet someone and take them to the hospital because they're a risk to themselves or someone else, it doesn't have the teeth. That does not have the teeth. And I was on a call with an officer today who had to pink sheet someone, not once, but twice in one day, because they were released from the ER right away. And then the officer found them acting on their suicide attempt and how to take them right back. And so it's got to be so stressful. I couldn't imagine being in the medical system right now. And I know that the ER is very overrun. in the first place, but let alone they also are kind of a drop-off center for mental health stuff, when really I'm sure they feel like this isn't supposed to be all for us. We need receiving centers. So I'm anxious for those to get up and running in hopes that we can build better connections, because that's, at least with Salt Lake, we're constantly trying to have meetings with different hospitals and discuss different cases, and just review, like, did we go wrong in dropping someone off there who shouldn't have been at the ER, or vice versa. And so I think those conversations are hard and uncomfortable as well, because on either side, it's a tricky, neither of us have a solution. And so we're trying to figure out, who does it go to? So I think the ER thing is very important to talk about with mental health.
And
I'd also like to, I just quickly wanted to plug also, for those of you that don't know, there's a really incredible intensive outpatient clinic at the U Health run by Dr. Stacy Bank, who is doing incredible things to try to give wraparound services to people who have behavioral health issues, severe and acute physical health issues, as well as potentially, they could be justice involved as well. But these are oftentimes the high utilizers both in our health system, our emergency rooms, and in our jails and institutions. So, these are things that I'm trying to help bring to scale, in terms of thinking about we need receiving centers. We need, healthcare that looks and understands that we need to have this kind of outreach, and that we can't just expect people to show up at our doors for their needs. So just a plug for the intensive outpatient clinic. Liz, please.
I was just going to say, surrounding Jessica's comments, I'm excited too for these receiving centers. And we know that there are going to be some issues that are going to need to be addressed. But for Davis County, the receiving center up there has been a huge success. And one of the biggest thing is that police and law enforcement up there in Davis County are able to take somebody in, and they spend 5 minutes checking them in, and then they hand it over to a behavioral health specialist who can go through an assessment, figure out the entire of the needs, where if you have an emergency care situation, a law enforcement officer can be detained for hours, and that is not helpful. And it's not helping the community policing reform or efforts that we've talked about before. And so we know that there are things that we need to get going, but some of these should be easy resources for our communities that can start immediately, and may take a little time to see the entire impact that they may have, but can have really good impact from the beginning. And so I have to congratulate and thank our legislators who, during a time of COVID, decided to make these receiving centers and mobile crisis teams a priority when they had to cut some of our important legislative funding in other areas. But they understood that this is something that needs to happen. And I hope that we can continue to see these kinds of efforts.
Thank you, Liz. I actually do have a quick question for you. So I read somewhere, and as I was learning about the receiving centers, is there an evaluation somewhere that our audience might be able to access? It looked like there may be one coming.
So one of the great things about Davis County is that they started up the receiving center as a county effort and then have received ongoing funding from the state legislature. So they have done several reports to the state legislature, one to Executive Appropriations Committee, and I'd be happy to get that to our producers and show and demonstrate what's been happening so that you can see what's happening in Davis County and what we're so excited to see in Salt Lake County, in Utah County, and in Washington County, these big hubs where people are. So
Yeah.
going to need.
And
access.
yeah, good to know that those reports, of course, are accessible. They're publicly available. This is what we mean by getting civically engaged, right? And going to these subcommittee legislative meetings. But I appreciate that. Thank you. Related to, sort of overall health and thinking about going down, continuing maybe down this conversation, this road of this conversation. Another question, do you see Medicare for all or similar universal healthcare programs as vital to being able to provide the healthcare and mental health support that our community needs? Misty, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, so if you don't have insurance, you can't get health care. Bottom line. Um, when I have a client come to me at Journey of Hope, number one, they need safe housing, and 90% of the time they don't have it. Number two is addiction, and number three is insurance. And they can't get help for the addiction without the insurance. They can't get help for the mental health or any other thing, the trauma, the whatever it is that they need to walk through without insurance. Now, how that ends up looking, I have no idea. But it needs to be more accessible to everybody, and it does. It's you know it's so crazy that the cutoff lines of where you're eligible, um, they're so low. If you have a family with 3 kids, their cutoff is, I mean, and then I'll take my personal experience as an example. I am on Social Security and SSI, and I have Medicaid and Medicare because of the cancer. Um, and I get this job with Journey of Hope, which is the most amazing experience in my world. Couldn't be better. And then immediately they start taking away the benefits that are helping me walk through the cancer. So it's like I'm being punished for trying to do better. Right. And we need to find a way so that we can reach the ones that are the poorest so that they can get the help they need to be able to stand up and walk through whatever it is that they have to walk through. And I think insurance is one of the big issues, one of the top 3 issues that we have to fight against right now. I think it's just crucial that we get insurance for these folks.
If I can continue on what Misty was saying, this is definitely something that we have focused on as a council because of the efforts in the last 5 years with the Justice Reform Initiative or Justice Reinvestment Initiative. And then when we did not expand Medicaid back at the beginning, there was an effort in 2016, which I have to give him all the credit. Representative Dunnigan passed what was called a targeted adult Medicaid. So that is helping these individuals in 4 different categories that covers both criminal justice involved, homeless, and then in need of a substance use or have a substance use disorder to qualify for Medicaid for a full year. That is immense. It is imperative because a full year can allow somebody to really get on their feet and figure out what their next step is so that they don't have to worry month to month. That was quite a feat and was something that was very important. And then trying to get people to know how they qualify and how to get signed up is the next barrier, right? And so we have organizations in the community like the Utah Health Policy Project that help people get signed up, walk them through all of the different things that they need to then figure out, do they qualify? What's going to happen? How do they stay qualified? And then how do they get into resources? There's always issues, and we know this. But if you help, and if people have the tenacity to keep trying, we're hoping that that resource is out there for them. And now with expanded Medicaid, we're hoping that it's going to cover yet another group that didn't have access before. Misty gives a great example of what we don't want to happen. Somebody's really trying to get on their feet. They find a great job where they can make a difference, and then they feel like they're getting punished. That's absolutely not what needs to happen. However, we do have certain restrictions and federal laws and changes that we may not have control over, but we need people that are advocates to help us figure out the system. And there are people out there that can do that, like health policy. So I think that the answer is absolutely. Utah is very particular in the way that we've approached things. We say we do it the Utah way, but our goal is to help people get access when they need it, and then figure out the next step when things change, because things seem to always change.
Thank you, Liz. Turning to another question that's more about the political sort of capital that we have as a panel and the stakeholders I think that we have access to. What is the point of this discussion? Without political influence, would Emily and the group be willing to advance legislation with the Utah House or Senate to create funding or requirements and changes, such as SimGill's 21 legislative changes? I, for one, am very civically engaged and very much would volunteer myself to testify to any legislative body about evidence-based practices when it comes to working with justice-involved people. And I think many of us on the panel would also be willing to do so and have done so in the past. So I do think there is some level of political influence, and that's part of the reason for having this kind of forum. That's sort of my take on it, right? I think you do have some people on the call here and on the panel who very much do care and want to have not just sort of have a discussion just to have a discussion, but to really be a part of solutions.
I think on top of that too, Emily, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, community education. I think even with this panel discussion, I think it helps educate the community on what goes into, what are the barriers we experience, what do we see day in and day out. I think that helps, especially, I don't know if the person who asked is involved in legislation, and I hope that if they are, they're taking some of what they've heard today and be able to apply it with the work that they do. And also some of us do already participate and hope to keep participating in some of these discussions. And I think it's just important to have discussions before an immediate legislative session, legislative focus, so that we can hear all different sides instead of me only going in from my own perspective and not including someone else's view on it. I just think it's important for us to have these discussions so others can listen in too.
Yeah.
As the state employee of the bunch, I would like to say that I know that legislators and your governor care. So when you speak, there is going to be people that are listening. And if 2020 has taught us nothing, is that it's that being involved will make a difference. And so absolutely, the USAVE Council, we have 42 members, which means that we cover a lot of different groups in order to get the most balanced approach. But we have open and public meetings that people can join, and I'd be happy to direct you to our website, and so that you can find out. But the other thing is, legislators do care, and they're going to listen, especially as you contact them and let them know of their concerns. I've mentioned a few things. Representative Dunnigan knew that there is a need for increased access to treatment. And so that was an effort. Access for law enforcement and peace officers to behavioral health resources is definitely something that came from the legislature and Representative Kwan. These are things that are happening, and there's a lot of discussion that goes on, and et cetera. But as Jessica mentioned, the legislative session is at our door, and it is time to get involved, because it's going to look a lot different this year, but it's also going to be a good year to have good discussion because of the issues that we faced in 2020.
Absolutely. Thank you.
think,
Misty, go ahead.
I think I'm terrified of public speaking, if y'all haven't figured that
You're
out.
doing great.
So when it comes to the legislature, I'm even more scared. But I'm here because I feel like if I don't open my voice or use my voice, then I'm doing a disservice to myself and others. And so it's like baby steps, right? I'm here and I'm having this conversation with you guys. And then what's next? What does that look like? Where do I go from there? And it's just baby steps. And eventually I'll be sitting in the legislation to have that conversation, have those hard conversations so that they can hear from my perspective. And that's part of the goal, but that's like way out there.
But you never know where things can lead, right? If you don't use your voice and choice, we don't
Nothing's gonna
we don't
change
know.
if I don't use my voice.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're just about wrapped up, so I think we should probably start to conclude our session. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions. I'm so excited and pleased to see how many participants we've had, and certainly how many questions have come to us on the panel. So yeah, wow, what an incredible discussion I feel like we've had here this evening. We hope our audience has been inspired to ask more questions, really, and to become more civically engaged in being part of the solutions. Solid evidence-informed solutions will require the voices of not just activists, police leadership, and academics, but certainly also those living in communities who need, rely on, and are impacted most by police services. I'd like to once again recognize our sponsors who were responsible for bringing this event together. So thank you to the League of Women Voters Salt Lake, Better Utah Institute, the NAACP Salt Lake Branch, the ACLU of Utah, the Utah Black Roundtable, and Journey of Hope. Please also remember to mark your calendars for our next panel discussion, which is going to actually focus on the police reform bills as we head into the next Utah legislative session. That event will be held on January 11th at 7 p.m. So thank you all for joining us, and good night.